Nagano Symphony employed a new orchestra conductor. He's one of the world's foremost conductors today, Kent Nagano. When Nagano started his reign as the conductor of the symphony, he decided that he would interpret Beethoven's Fifth. This is one of Beethoven's great symphonies. It's the one that includes Ode to Joy, which has had a peppered history at best. It's the national hymn of the European Union. It was also Hitler's favorite symphony. It's also the national hymn of Zimbabwe. I'm sure that Beethoven must roll over in his grave sometimes when he heard it being used. But when Nagano did it, he did something different because he was very committed to democratizing classical music. He sold out Place des Arts in a matter of minutes, 2,400 seats. He then made sure that in front of Place des Arts, there was going to be places for 12,000 people to watch and listen to his interpretation on Beethoven right there on the Esplanade. And then he negotiated with Radio-Canada to have it broadcast simultaneously all over the network. For 3 hours, 5% of Quebecers were watching Kent Nagano interpret Beethoven's Fifth. I mean, when was the last time that 5% of people in Ontario were watching classical music? Now, you only have to come to my city in the first week of July to see where I'm going on this, because then you have the Jazz Festival. And imagine, on the middle Wednesday of the 10-day Jazz Festival, we have the Grand Éclatement, the big blowout, where anywhere between 185,000 and 250,000 people gather to listen to jazz for 3 hours. And you know what? In the last 10 years, the police have not had to make one single arrest. Now, what I'm trying to say here is that in spatial and architectural forms, there are things going on in cities that are deeply rooted about the cultural processes. You can't do urban ministry in my city if you don't take the arts seriously. Now, there will be things in your city that will want to make you think the same way. That's my first preliminary reflection. My second has to deal with poverty. Now, again, we could go on for this for the whole forum, and I know that you have addressed it. Let me just, this is why it's a preliminary reflection, I just want to give this briefly. A fundamental question that we need to examine at every junction of community development in Canadian cities is about how poverty affects worldviews and how worldviews, or what I prefer, the term social imaginaries, affects poverty. Now, I realize that poverty is hopelessly difficult to measure in Canada. That's probably no wonder that we have 3 different indicators about it. The 3 different indicators make it confusing. It's probably the way to keep us confused. So we have the median revenue standard, we have the poverty level, that's Stats Canada's way, we've got the breadbasket measure that the Conference Board uses, and then we've got the one that most of us as urban ministry or community development organizers use, the low income cutoffs. But none of these are sufficient because they're all rooted in understanding poverty economically. They need to be cross-indexed to other issues. So, for example, people outside of Quebec have been astounded at how poverty has declined in Quebec in the last decade. It's all of a sudden like we discovered oil or something. No, we didn't discover oil. We discovered that if you invent something called $7 a day childcare, which in and of itself is an intriguing piece of social engineering, or re-engineering, but it has incredible consequences on the decline of poverty. I mean, just do the math. If a single mom can send her kid to childcare for $35 a week, $140 a month, she's just got that much more money in her pocket. And that affects poverty. So we didn't discover oil. All we've got in Quebec is water and hydroelectricity. But you see what you do here, you cross-index things. But here's another fascinating fascinating piece in my city that you always need to talk about when you talk about poverty. For that portion of the population that doesn't make it to grade 10, secondary 4 in our system, that person will probably only earn about $23,500 a year for her working career. She'll top out at that. Whereas a university graduate in my city will start at $41,000 and will move up. So when we deal with poverty, we have to be wrestling with issues other than just the economic issues. Because essentially, poverty is about relationships. It's not just about economics. It's a broad concept that includes economic, social, emotional, mental, physical, and spiritual realities. It is often intergenerational, and that's in part what I want to talk about today. But at its very heart, poverty affects identity and it affects vocation. Identity because it includes social exclusion and an absence of harmony in life and well-being. It affects vocation because people feel deprived in their ability to contribute in any way to the life and the welfare of the community. And that's where the social imaginary comes in, where worldviews comes in. Because people then begin to believe they don't have choices. And that's why poverty and fatalism are so intricately tied together. You see, when people think they don't have choices, they're caught in perpetual webs of chronic poverty. And that would then lead to my third preliminary reflection, which is just briefly about community development. For any of you that are familiar with my publications, you know how I've written on this extensively. I won't bore you with any of that. But let me just say that I see community development as part of that, and here's the technical term, the organizational field that has a preferential option for local community services. It includes mobilization, partnership, and engagement. It's mobilization because it's mobilizing a vast number of partners that have an increasing awareness based on their deepest values and assumptions and desires, and they want to confront issues that are destroying both their individual lives, their families, and their communities. They're desirous to build social capital, and so they know they need to mobilize for those issues. It includes partnerships, because this organizational field includes numbers of grassroots participants, which are fundamentally volunteers. But then it engages local agencies, and many of us represent those today, who are partners in this process. We're part of the funding base. We engage the three levels of local government to address issues. It's about holistic partnerships. But then finally, it's about engagement. Because it means that we can only tackle community development as we address the issues of power, capacity, and especially trust amongst partners who want to bring their assets to the table to improve the quality of life and get involved in the pursuit of the peace and the well-being of the community. Now, obviously, for me, social capital is an important part in understanding this. And so social capital is that coordination and cooperation of resources to pursue the common good. But if I can put it simply, I really think that community development is about journeying in community to express aspirations, discover assets, listen to people's hopes and desires, confront limitations, and generate solutions and implement them for the peace and well-being of children, families, and the neighborhood. Now, out of those three preliminary reflections, that all of community development will be deeply contextual, that we have to have a bigger understanding of poverty, and third of all, just, what is community development? Let me then just address two issues now out of space, if you will, out of the social imaginary of what's going on in our cities, that are going to become important if we're going to do community development in a sustainable way, but in a Canadian way. This past week, the UN agency Habitat, not Habitat for Humanity, but the UN agency Habitat, in coordination with the World Health Organization, published their next report. If you Google UN Habitat, you can download it. It was called Hidden Cities, and it had to deal with health issues in global urbanization. It's quite a fascinating report. It's well worth reading. But it's the title that intrigued me. Because the two issues that I want to look at, I firmly believe are part of what's hidden in our cities today, and it's why we need to take them seriously. The first one has to do with the public-private divide that is so paramount in Canadian cities today. It obviously has to do with hyper-individuality, with what Charles Taylor calls the autonomous self. But it shows up by the increasing number of people who are living alone. And here's what's counterintuitive, and they're poor. And the second issue that I want to look at is the just redistribution of resources in our communities and the issue of intergenerational poverty. Let's go at them in that order. When I talk about the first issue, the public-private split that takes place in our cities, and most of us would be familiar with this under the rubric, although it's not the issue I want to look at today, where people say, religion should not be in public life, it should be in the private world. Okay? It's kind of part of the whole kit and caboodle, but I don't want to deal with that issue today. That's maybe for questions if we want. But when we talk about this public-private divide in our cities, it's important to understand how the term gets used. It becomes a catch-all for everything, and that's not helpful at all. Sometimes we talk about public life as citizenship. That's the res publica that the Romans invented. Or sometimes we talk about public administration as opposed to private company. So, for example, Ontario Hydro is a public company. Air Canada is a public company.